Okay, welcome to this remote meeting of the decision session of the Executive Member for Finance and Performance on Wednesday, the 7th of October. With me today, I've got two council officers, Pauline Stutchfield and Dave Walker, who will introduce themselves on the necessary items, though I understand Pauline is suffering from a slight chest infection, so maybe slightly quieter than usual. Item 1 on the agenda is declarations of interest. I have no declarations of interest. Item 2 is the minutes of the meeting held on the 24th of September. I'm happy to accept those as a correct record and will sign those when I'm able to when I enter into West offices. Item 3 is public participation. We have no members of the public registered to speak today. So I'll go on to the first item, substantive item on the agenda, which is item 4, COVID-19 local restriction support grant. And I'll hand over to David.
Thank you, Councillor. I'm David Walker, Head of Customer Exchequer Services. So this paper presents to the Executive Member for a decision the Council's local restriction support grant and scheme, and the Executive Member is asked to note the details of the government scheme, approve the council scheme and discretionary scheme attached to Annex A, and approve the value of the discretionary payments grant. The government introduced this scheme on the 9th of September 2020, and the scheme's purpose is to support local businesses who are affected by local lockdown schemes for a period of more than 3 weeks. The scheme is basically in two elements. The first element is businesses that have a rateable value, for which the government provides the funding and sets the amount of payment. And the second element is for businesses out of rateable value, which is the discretionary scheme. In terms of the prescribed element of the scheme around rateable value, the government have set two levels. £1,500 for the full 3-week period for a business which is having to close with a rateable value of £51,000 and above, and a payment of £1,000 for 3 weeks for any business that has a rateable value below £51,000. So unlike the previous grant schemes, there are no caps around rateable values. Every business that can prove they're affected and customer facing can make a claim on this scheme. In terms of the discretionary scheme, we're suggesting, rather like the government, that we keep this relatively simple and straightforward to administer, and that any grant that we make for the 3-week period for businesses, micro businesses who are customer facing and have to close during the 3-week period, we make a payment of £750 for the 3-week period. This again is slightly in line with the amount that's paid on isolation grants, and I think it's also worth noting that the grants now being paid are about 6% of what were paid on the initial grants that were paid at the start of the COVID crisis. So in terms of the discretionary scheme, again, the funding pot is restricted to authorities. So we are given 5% of the total funding that are provided for the government scheme during the lockdown period. We do not yet know how much that is, so we don't know how much that 5% will be. But given that the amount of grant now being awarded is something like 6% of the original discretionary grants, the 5% will be a very small pot. So we're not likely to have a great deal of money. But until we get into lockdown, which hopefully we can avoid, we won't know the exact figures. The payments are paid directly to the council taxpayer, business rates payer, and there will be an application process. Businesses have to apply and confirm in writing, and as with previous grants that we issued, there will be fraud checks. So again, we need to use a spotlight scheme when making payments, and that in summary is the scheme.
Thank you, David. That's answered one of my questions already then, that you don't know what the 5% figure.
Not on this one, no, I'm sorry.
Having read the report, is it right in saying that places with multiple hereditaries is the word that I've now learned this year, I never knew before, are eligible for one per establishment rather than one per business?
On the government grant, if they have more than one hereditament, so some of the cafes in the city do, then they would be entitled to one per hereditament. If it's on the discretionary grant, it's one payment per business.
Right. And so, in that sense, assuming we were going to lockdown, is that 5% is that of a capped figure, or is that as per the previous grant in terms of how many people apply?
I believe it's a capped figure. This scheme came out really, really quickly. All we know is that the government are calculating based on the the business rate base that we have, which comes through the Valuation Office agency, how many businesses may be eligible for the £1,000 and £1,500. They will give us that sum, and we will get 5% of that sum. I think we would be able to challenge that if we felt that they'd miscalculated it, but I wouldn't expect the variation, because they know exactly how many businesses on our list to be huge, because they're not guessing at what those businesses are, rather like the retail, hospitality and leisure that we're guessing. This time they actually know how many businesses are on there. So I suspect the figure is probably pretty much final.
Yeah. Then there would still be an element of risk in the government-backed scheme. If there were more applicants than the actual allocation, we would have to.
We would definitely ask them for further money if they miscalculated, and I think they'll accept that they may miscalculate or make small errors. So I think we could go back and ask them.
I suppose my final question is, what should be the same for the next one as well, is what scope do we have in terms of amending the scheme? Should it turn out in the event of a lockdown that there are a number of businesses that aren't getting the support we need? Do we have the option to increase additional flexibility into that discretionary scheme at a later date?
The discretionary scheme really is for us to decide. So if we wish to create more flexibility in there, yes, we could. Clearly the cap, the restriction that we have is that they won't give us any more money. So whatever we choose to do may cost the authority as opposed to central government.
I think on this one, I'll get to the one later on, because there seems to be more of a risk of clawback in terms of the second scheme on here, but I'll take that as part of the next agenda item.
Okay.
Okay. General comments was just to commend the team in terms of the speed with which it's turned around. It's not ideal to have a scheme announced that starts before the scheme's even been announced, and criteria that have started before the scheme's announced. So I suppose less of an issue with this one at the point that we're not in a situation of lockdown as yet. So we do have the opportunity in terms of getting the scheme in place. Let's say with the second one coming on, there's an opportunity that we've got significant amounts of people who are eligible for the scheme before even being announced and fully put through the criteria. So I think with that one, the only thing I'm looking at, David, is I can't actually see a recommendations paragraph. I have something in terms of paragraph 2, yeah. So note the details of the scheme, approve the discretionary scheme, and approve the value. So yeah, I'm happy with that to approve the recommendations in paragraph 2. Okay, so as I'm alluding to, then we can go on to the next item on the agenda, which is item 5, which is the self-isolation financial support scheme.
Okay, thank you. So this is the self-isolation grant scheme, and this is to provide financial support to vulnerable financial customers who are put into isolation through the current processes around testing, or being told that they've come into contact with somebody who's tested positive for COVID-19. The recommendations again are at paragraph 2, and that is to note the details of the scheme, approve the council scheme and discretionary scheme, which are attached to Annex A and B, and to approve that decisions on discretionary payments are made by the service administering the council's discretionary welfare support. Yes, this scheme again announced on the 20th of September and went actually live on the 28th of September in terms of when customers became eligible to claim. The scheme's based very much around trying to provide financial support for people who have to self-isolate, who are on low income, and also that includes people who are self-employed as well as people who are in normal employment. It's a means-tested scheme to the extent that you have to be receiving one of the benefits set out in the final point of paragraph 5. So that's universal credit, working tax credit, income-based employment and support allowance, income-based job seekers allowance, income support, housing benefit or pension credit. The scheme's devised really to be an online scheme, so we are working on putting live, hopefully by Friday, an online application for customers. There's already information up on the website for customers if they want information around the scheme, but for customers who can't, then we can complete the forms for them if they phone in. They will still need to provide supporting documentation. I think this one, in terms of the cap on what we're able to do on this is kind of a bit more clear to us. So the government have already provided funding figures. So we've been given £66,000 in terms of the core scheme. And that means that we would be able to make a maximum of up to 500 payments. In terms of the discretionary scheme, now the discretionary scheme is based around allowing the authority to see whether or not some customers present to be in financial difficulty as a result of having to self-isolate, but don't completely meet the government's criteria. Again, we need to understand who will come forward. But despite that, the government have capped the money available for that element of the scheme. So, and that's capped through to the end of the scheme, which is supposed to be the 31st of January 2021 at this point. And that provides the authority with about £39.8 thousand, which is enough for 79 payments. Now, I guess trying to put perspective on this is really quite hard, because the figures we were told was maybe 3 or 4 applications per week, but that was prior to the current escalation in the number of infections in the community. Since the scheme went live on the 28th, we've received 34 applications as of this morning for the scheme. Now, whilst that sounds high compared with the grant that we have, as I understand it, the app and the NHS app and the information that's being given out is telling customers that they may be eligible, but it's not explaining that your lockdown grant you may be eligible for is means tested. So it's important to us that we get the online form up as soon as possible, because that will stop people who don't meet the criteria from continuing with the application. Whereas at the minute, what we're getting is a volume of emails from customers coming through asking whether or not they're eligible. So this is, again, it's a scheme to the 31st of January next year. We don't know, again, if we spend the £66,000 on the core part of the scheme, whether or not we can go back and ask for additional funding. Now, I've tried to pursue this, and I know other authorities have asked the same question. So whilst we won't get any more for the discretionary pot, will they pay us more than 66,000 if we have to pay more than 132 customers? So we're still trying to find out whether that will or will not be the case. Again, I suspect a lot of that will depend on the volume of claims that come in nationally. Thank you.
Thank you, David. I think this was the one that probably caused me a little bit more concern in terms of that, because it just seemed from reading the paper that it's government discretion whether they pay back what we've included in the discretionary. So I assume that what you've done is to align the discretionary scheme as closely as possible, so that the government wouldn't say, no, we're not paying that particular claim.
That's right. I mean, we as well. It's interesting because the answer to both of these schemes that I've been presenting is that we as with previous schemes, we get audited, and we're fully audited on what we spend, and therefore the government can see how we're paying. The one element on this scheme that's of interest is that they're not interested in seeing what we spend on the discretionary scheme, which would suggest to me that despite spending the fund relatively quickly, if that was the case, we would not be able to go back and ask for additional funding. That's left that responsibility quite firmly with local authorities to try and ration that out across the period. And if they spend it and wish to continue supporting, then they look as though they will absolutely not provide any more money for that.
I think that's what's called passing the buck, David.
Yes, yes. In simple terms, yes, they've passed on that one.
We have made provision for these individuals. If you can't get it from your local authority, then it's their fault. And gloss over the funding isn't enough.
Yeah, I think what we've tried to think through is which customers who are not on welfare benefits might suffer as a result of this, and might be in financial difficulty and come forward to make a claim. And because people who are in full-time employment who's paid full pay during isolation would not. But I guess there'll be things that come out that we're not expecting. I mean, one area that I think may arise again is self-employed. So whilst they're in the core scheme, they're running the core scheme to the extent that they are receiving benefits. But you may find there are a self-employed scheme with people within the city who find that not being able to work for 2 weeks but not being on benefits is a financial stress to them. But of course, as a business, they can also apply for the lockdown grants during they can apply for both, but they can only apply for the lockdown grants during lockdown. It doesn't apply in isolation, so they don't get any grant funding during isolation. So we'll see what comes through. So we have kind of been handed that, and I think until we get any claims that fall outside the prescribed government scheme, we won't really know what the demand's going to be.
Question I had was around, there's the mention of the multiple applications, which sounds like an immense amount of fun for your team. But people can do it as long as there's no crossover period. How do we assess whether somebody has applied previously, and if so, that there isn't that 2 to 3 day crossover?
Yeah, basically, we will be keeping a record of all the claims under the unique reference number and the period that we've paid for. So whilst it's unlikely they would overlap, it's a possibility, but unlikely that they would overlap. We would certainly, by keeping those records, be able to see when the payment was made and avoid duplicating payments. And we have to keep those records because not only should we, but we need to provide them for audit purposes to central government. So that will be managed.
Okay, and last sort of 2 points was appreciate the need to keep things online, and then there is the option to apply by telephone. I wasn't sure how that sits with some of the evidence that needs to be supplied.
As I said, we may still need customers to provide evidence to us, depending what circumstances they present when they phone. There's 2 options that they can probably take around that. One would be to actually drop the information in. I think a point I missed around this, we are supposed to pay the customer, try to pay the customer within 48 hours and a maximum of 3 days. So we are supposed to process these claims as quickly as possible, obviously because of the hardship to media. I think one of the challenges we have around that is that rather like the lockdown grants, we still need to do the fraud checks on the customers, and we still need the evidence providing by the customers. Now, if they can scan it and email it to us, or photograph it with their smartphones or whatever else, that providing we're comfortable with what's being sent to us, then we should be able to accept it. If we had a customer who really couldn't and had no access to digital or any other means, then they would have to bring that documentation to us with no choice. Or we could potentially let the local area coordinators or the hubs confirm that as well. So we could take that route to resolving that issue.
That's what I was going to suggest, Dave, as you got there at the end. If we can work with them to either be able to do that accepting, or even to be able to sort of handhold people through using the Explore centres. If we can actually get people into the Explore centres and get them applying online through there, that might actually get us through some of that. So my plea was you to connect with those local area coordinators, not to try and do that. And the last thing was probably just a request to keep me updated on the progress with the discretionary scheme and what types of people are starting to apply and what gaps there might be, just to keep us in the loop of what's happening on that one. Yeah,
of course we can do that.
So with that one, I've got three recommendations, 2 A, B, and C on page 35. I think I'm happy to approve those as is. I'll say there's not an awful lot of discretion in discretionary schemes as we go forward. I think it is concerning the amount of money that's been made available. I think we'll have to keep a close eye on it. I know there was speakers at executive last week that were talking about people who would be potentially vulnerable from self-isolating who aren't covered in this scheme. And I think with 79 payments to a population of 200,000 people is somewhat of a concern. But I think as long as we keep an eye on that and do what we can in terms of lobbying government to make sure we have that available. So I think with that, happy to approve the recommendations at paragraph 2 on page 35.
Thank you.
I believe, as I have no urgent business, I'm happy to declare the meeting closed.